The bloodied mountain man stood in her doorway, cradling a tiny infant against his chest, his weathered face etched with desperation and exhaustion. Sandra Hill's heart hammered against her ribs as she took in the sight before her. This stranger who had emerged from the storm like something out of a nightmare, yet holding something so precious, so vulnerable. The baby's soft whimpers cut through the howling wind, and without a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside and gestured them into the warmth of her humble cabin. 3 days earlier, the first snow of the season had begun to fall across the Montana Territory, blanketing the rugged landscape in a deceptive beauty that masked the harsh realities of frontier life. Sandra had been preparing for the long winter ahead, her small cabin stocked with preserved foods and firewood, though she knew the months ahead would test every ounce of her resolve. Since her husband's death the previous spring, she had learned to rely on herself in ways she never imagined possible, finding strength in solitude even as loneliness threatened to consume her. The wind had been picking up steadily throughout the afternoon, rattling the shutters and sending spirals of snow dancing across the frozen ground. Sandra moved about her daily tasks with practiced efficiency, checking her supplies one final time before the storm truly settled in. She had learned to read the signs in the sky, the way the clouds gathered and the air grew heavy with the promise of snow. This would be a big one, she could tell, the kind that could trap a person for days or even weeks. As she stoked the fire in her stone hearth, Sandra allowed herself a moment to remember the warmth of companionship, the comfort of shared conversation on nights like these. Her husband Paul had been gone for 8 months now, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could cure, leaving her alone in this vast wilderness with nothing but her memories and her determination to survive. The cabin felt too large sometimes, too quiet, filled with echoes of laughter and love that now existed only in her heart. The storm arrived with a vengeance just as darkness fell, transforming the world outside into a swirling chaos of white and wind. Sandra secured the shutters and settled in for what she knew would be a long night, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth while the storm raged beyond her walls. She had grown accustomed to these solitary evenings, finding solace in simple tasks like mending clothes or reading from her small collection of books by lamplight. Meanwhile, 20 miles away through the treacherous mountain passes, Roy Brooks fought his way through the blizzard with a determination born of desperation. The infant in his arms had not stopped crying for hours, her tiny voice barely audible above the howling wind, and he knew that without shelter soon, neither of them would survive the night. His horse had gone lame 2 days ago, forcing him to continue on foot through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain man under the best of conditions. Roy's story had begun a week earlier when he had discovered the aftermath of an Indian raid on a small settlement near the Canadian border. The carnage had been complete, every building burned, every adult killed, but somehow, miraculously, he had heard the faint cry of an infant coming from beneath the rubble of what had once been a family home. The baby girl, no more than a few months old, had been hidden in a root cellar by her mother, protected from the violence that had claimed her family. He had no idea who the child was or where her relatives might be found, but Roy knew he could not leave her to die alone in the wilderness. His own tragic past had taught him the value of every innocent life, the weight of responsibility that came with the power to save or abandon another human being. Years ago, he had failed to protect his own family when raiders had attacked his homestead, arriving home too late to do anything but bury the dead and live with the guilt that haunted his every waking moment. The baby had been weak when he found her, dehydrated and hungry, but she had responded to his care with the resilience that seemed to define life on the frontier. He had fashioned a crude carrier from his coat and rope, keeping her close to his body for warmth as they began their journey toward the nearest settlement. But the weather had turned against them, and now he found himself lost in a blizzard with a dying child, and no clear idea of where safety might be found. Roy's hands were numb with cold, despite his thick gloves, and ice had formed in his beard and eyebrows, making each breath a painful reminder of their desperate situation. The baby had grown quiet in the last hour, a development that terrified him more than her crying had. He knew the signs of exposure, the way the body began to shut down when pushed beyond its limits, and he feared that his efforts to save this innocent child would end in failure, just as they had so many years ago. But something drove him forward through the storm, some inner compass that refused to accept defeat. Perhaps it was the memory of his own lost children, or perhaps it was simply the stubborn refusal to give up that had kept him alive through years of hardship and loss. Whatever the source of his determination, Roy pressed on through the snow, following what he hoped was a path toward salvation. The wind had been his enemy and his guide, carrying away his voice when he tried to call for help, but also bringing him the faint scent of wood smoke that suggested human habitation somewhere ahead. He had learned to trust his instincts during his years in the mountains, to read the subtle signs that could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving landscape. The smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people meant hope for the tiny life he carried. As he crested a small ridge, Roy caught sight of a dim light flickering through the storm, barely visible through the swirling snow, but unmistakably the glow of a window. His heart leaped with relief and renewed determination as he stumbled down the slope toward what appeared to be a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees. The structure looked solid and well-maintained, with smoke rising steadily from its chimney, promising warmth and shelter from the deadly cold. Sandra had been dozing by the fire when she heard the sound, a faint thumping that seemed to come from her front door. At first she thought it might be the wind, or perhaps a branch blown against the cabin by the storm, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too persistent to be anything but human. Her heart began to race as she realized someone was out there in the blizzard, someone desperate enough to risk their life traveling in such conditions. She approached the door cautiously, her hand resting on the rifle that hung beside the entrance. Living alone had taught her to be careful, to assume the worst until proven otherwise, but the knocking continued with a quality that spoke more of desperation than threat. When she called out to ask who was there, the voice that answered was rough with cold and exhaustion, barely recognizable as human speech. "Please," the voice said, and in that single word Sandra heard a world of pain and need that cut straight through her caution. "I have a baby. She's dying." The word struck her like a physical blow, erasing every thought of personal safety or prudent caution. Without hesitation, Sandra threw back the heavy wooden bar that secured her door and pulled it open, revealing the sight that would remain burned in her memory forever. The man who stood before her was barely recognizable as human, covered in ice and snow, his face gaunt with exhaustion and exposure. But in his arms he held something that made her heart stop. The baby was so small, so still, wrapped in what appeared to be pieces of the man's own clothing. Her tiny face was pale with cold, her lips tinged with blue, and for a terrifying moment Sandra thought they might already be too late. But then she saw the almost imperceptible rise and fall of the infant's chest, the slight flutter of her eyelids, and she knew there was still hope. "Come in quickly," Sandra said, stepping aside and ushering them into the warmth of her cabin. The contrast between the bitter cold outside and the cozy interior was so stark that steam rose from the man's clothing as he crossed the threshold, and Sandra could see him swaying on his feet, pushed to the very limits of his endurance. She guided him to a chair near the fire, her hands gentle but urgent as she helped him settle the baby more comfortably in his arms. "What's your name?" she asked as she began to stoke the fire, adding more wood to build up the heat that would be essential for warming the child safely. "Roy Brooks," he managed through chattering teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "Found her. Settlement was attacked. Everyone else was dead." Sandra felt her heart clench with sympathy and horror at his words, understanding immediately the tragedy that had brought them to her door. She had heard stories of such attacks, the brutal reality of frontier life that could destroy entire families in a matter of hours, leaving only emptiness and sorrow in their wake. But somehow this tiny child had survived, saved by the courage and determination of a stranger who had risked everything to bring her to safety. "Let me see her," Sandra said gently, extending her arms toward the baby. Roy hesitated for just a moment, his protective instincts warring with his recognition that the child needed more help than he could provide. Finally, with infinite care, he transferred the infant to Sandra's waiting arms, and she felt the familiar weight of a baby against her chest, a sensation she had not experienced since her own children had been stillborn years ago. The baby was frighteningly cold and still, her breathing shallow and irregular, but Sandra had helped deliver and care for enough children in her community to know what needed to be done. She moved quickly but calmly, wrapping the child in warm blankets from her own bed while instructing Roy to move closer to the fire. The process of warming someone suffering from severe exposure had to be gradual, she knew. Too much heat too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. She needs to eat, Sandra said as she examined the baby more closely, noting the signs of dehydration and hunger that spoke of days without proper nourishment. How long has it been since she last fed? Roy shook his head helplessly, his exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I don't know. I found some milk at a trading post 2 days ago, but it's been gone since yesterday. I tried to give her water, but she wouldn't take much. Sandra nodded, understanding the challenges he had faced trying to care for an infant under such impossible conditions. She moved to her pantry and retrieved a small jar of preserved milk, diluting it carefully with warm water to create something that might be gentle enough for the baby's delicate system. The process was familiar to her, a skill learned during her years as the unofficial midwife for her small community, though she had never imagined using it under such desperate circumstances. As she worked to prepare the makeshift formula, Sandra found herself stealing glances at the man who had brought this child to her door. Roy Brooks was clearly a mountain man, his clothing practical and well-worn, his hands calloused from years of hard work and survival in the wilderness. His face, now that she could see it clearly in the firelight, bore the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of deeper pain, older wounds that went beyond physical hardship. You've been traveling for days, she observed as she tested the temperature of the milk mixture against her wrist. In this weather, with a baby, that took incredible courage. Roy looked up from where he sat hunched near the fire, his expression guarded. Wasn't courage, was necessity. Couldn't leave her there to die. There was something in his tone, a finality that suggested this was not the first time he had faced such a choice. And Sandra wondered what other tragedies had shaped this quiet, determined man. She had learned to read people during her years on the frontier, to see beyond the surface to the stories that drove them, and she sensed that Roy Brooks carried burdens that went far deeper than his current mission of mercy. The baby stirred slightly as Sandra began to feed her tiny mouth working instinctively even in her weakened state. It was a good sign, Sandra knew, evidence that the child's survival instincts were still strong despite her ordeal. She worked patiently, allowing the infant to take only small amounts at a time, knowing that too much too quickly could cause more harm than good. What's her name? Sandra asked softly as she continued the feeding. Don't know, Roy replied, his voice heavy with sadness. Never found anyone alive to ask. She was hidden in a root cellar when I found her. Her mother must have put her there before. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined the desperation of a mother hiding her child in those final moments, the love and hope that had driven her to save the one life she could protect. It was a sacrifice that resonated deeply with her own experiences of loss, her own understanding of what it meant to face the unthinkable and still find the strength to act. She'll need a name, Sandra said quietly. Something beautiful, to honor what her mother did for her. Roy nodded, but said nothing, his attention focused on the fire as if he could find answers in its flickering flames. Sandra understood his reluctance to make such a decision, the weight of responsibility that came with naming a child whose entire family had been lost. It was a choice that would define this little girl's identity, her place in a world that had already shown her its cruelest face. As the night wore on, Sandra worked tirelessly to care for both her unexpected guests. The baby's condition gradually improved as she warmed and took nourishment, her breathing becoming stronger and more regular, her color slowly returning to a healthier pink. Roy, meanwhile, sat silent and watchful, his eyes never straying far from the child he had carried through the storm, as if he feared that looking away might somehow undo all his efforts to save her. Sandra prepared a simple meal of stew and bread, the warm food filling the cabin with comforting aromas that seemed to push back against the cold and darkness outside. She noticed how Roy ate mechanically, without pleasure, as if food was merely fuel necessary for survival rather than something to be enjoyed. It was the behavior of someone who had known real hunger, who had learned not to take such basic comforts for granted. You haven't asked me anything about myself, Sandra observed as they ate. Most men would be curious about a woman living alone out here. Roy looked up from his bowl, his expression thoughtful. Figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know. Everybody's got their reasons for ending up in places like this. His words revealed an understanding of frontier life that went beyond mere experience. A recognition that people often came to the wilderness carrying secrets and sorrows they preferred to leave unexamined. Sandra appreciated his discretion, even as she found herself wanting to share her own story with this quiet stranger who had brought such unexpected purpose into her solitary existence. My husband died last spring, she said simply. Fever took him, and I couldn't bear to leave this place. Too many memories, I suppose, but they're all I have left of him. Roy nodded, his expression softening slightly. Sorry for your loss. Can't be easy, making it on your own out here. It's not, Sandra admitted, but I've managed so far. This cabin was built to last, and I've got enough supplies to see me through the winter. Though I'll admit, having company for a change is... She paused, searching for the right words. It's nice to have someone to talk to. The admission hung in the air between them, a moment of vulnerability that seemed to shift something in the atmosphere of the small cabin. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, warmed by fire and fed by simple human kindness, something new was taking root. The baby had fallen asleep in Sandra's arms, her tiny fist curled against the soft fabric of the blanket, her breathing deep and peaceful. Sandra found herself reluctant to put the child down, savoring the weight and warmth of the small body against her chest. It had been so long since she had held a baby, since she had felt needed in such a fundamental way. She's beautiful, Sandra whispered, gazing down at the sleeping infant. Her mother must have been heartbroken, knowing she had to leave her. Roy's jaw tightened, and Sandra saw pain flicker across his features. I keep thinking about that. What it must have been like, hearing them coming and knowing there was nowhere to run, having just enough time to hide her and pray someone would find her. Someone did find her, Sandra said firmly. You did, and you brought her here, through a blizzard that could have killed you both. That has to mean something. Roy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was so low Sandra had to strain to hear it. I had children once, a boy and a girl. Raiders came while I was hunting, and when I got back... He stopped, unable to continue. Sandra felt her heart break for this man who had already lost so much, who had found the strength to save another child despite carrying the weight of his own tragedy. She understood now why he had been so determined to bring the baby to safety, why he had risked everything for a stranger's child. How long ago? She asked gently. 5 years. 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The precision of his answer spoke volumes about the depth of his grief, the way the loss had marked every day since. And you've been alone all this time? Roy nodded. Couldn't stay in that place. Couldn't bear to be around families and children. Took to the mountains. Figured I'd live out my days trapping and hunting, not bothering anybody and not being bothered. But you came down from the mountains for her, Sandra observed, looking down at the sleeping baby. You could have left her at that trading post. Let someone else take responsibility. No, Roy said firmly. I couldn't. Soon as I heard her crying, I knew I had to see it through. Maybe it's my chance to do something right for once. Sandra understood the weight of that statement, the way guilt and grief could drive a person to seek redemption through service to others. She had felt something similar in her own darkest moments, the need to find meaning in loss, to transform suffering into something that might help heal the world's wounds. The storm began to subside sometime after midnight, the howling wind gradually diminishing to a whisper, though the snow continued to fall steadily outside. Sandra had dozed fitfully in her chair, the baby still cradled in her arms, while Roy kept watch by the fire, adding wood as needed to maintain the warmth that was so essential for the child's recovery. When Sandra woke near dawn, she found Roy standing by the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The world outside was buried under several feet of fresh snow, the familiar landmarks rendered unrecognizable by the storm's fury. It would be days before travel was possible, she realized, days before Roy could continue his journey to find the baby a permanent home. Looks like you'll be staying for a while, she said softly, careful not to wake the sleeping infant. Roy turned from the window, his expression unreadable. If you'll have us. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you let us in. I wouldn't have it any other way, Sandra replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her conviction. This little one needs time to recover, and honestly, I could use the help around here. Winter's hard enough without trying to manage everything alone. Something shifted in Roy's expression, a cautious hope that he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. I'm handy enough with repairs and such. Could earn my keep while we're here. It's not about earning anything, Sandra said. It's about doing what's right, what's human. Over the following days, an unexpected routine developed in the small cabin. Roy proved to be as capable as he had claimed, repairing loose boards and reinforcing the shutters against future storms. Sandra continued to care for the baby, who grew stronger with each passing day, her appetite returning and her color improving dramatically. The child had begun to smile, a development that brought joy to both adults and seemed to lighten the atmosphere of grief that had surrounded their initial meeting. Sandra found herself looking forward to the evenings when they would sit by the fire together, Roy whittling small toys for the baby, while Sandra mended clothes or prepared meals. Their conversations were often sparse, both of them accustomed to solitude, but there was a comfortable quality to their shared silence that spoke of growing trust and understanding. She needs that name, Sandra said one evening as she rocked the baby to sleep. We can't keep calling her the baby forever. Roy looked up from the wooden rattle he was carving, his hands pausing in their work. What would you suggest? Hope, Sandra said without hesitation. Her name should be Hope, because that's what she represents, what her mother gave her by hiding her away. Hope for the future. Roy considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Hope, I like that. It suits her. As if responding to her new name, the baby opened her eyes and looked directly at Sandra, her gaze clear and alert in a way that seemed to acknowledge the gift she had been given. Sandra felt tears well up in her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of the moment, the way this tiny life had brought meaning and purpose back into her world. The days passed in a blur of domestic routine that felt both foreign and familiar to Sandra. She had forgotten the rhythm of caring for an infant, the way every few hours brought new demands for feeding, changing, and comforting. But she had also forgotten the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing new life, from watching a helpless creature grow stronger and more responsive under her care. Roy proved to be surprisingly gentle with Hope, his large hands infinitely careful as he helped with her care. Sandra watched him feed the baby one morning, his weathered face soft with concentration, and she saw glimpses of the father he had once been, the tenderness that tragedy had buried but not destroyed. You're good with her, Sandra observed as Roy successfully coaxed Hope to take her bottle. Had practice, he replied simply. My daughter was about this age when... He trailed off, but Sandra understood. What was her name? Mary, and my boy was called James. Roy's voice was steady, but Sandra could see the effort it took for him to speak their names aloud. They'd be grown now if they'd lived. Mary would have been 16 last month. Sandra felt her heart ache for this man who carried such loss with quiet dignity, who had found the strength to save another child despite his own devastating grief. She reached out and touched his hand gently, a gesture of comfort that seemed to surprise them both with its naturalness. They would be proud of you, she said softly, for saving Hope, for being the kind of man who couldn't walk away from a child in need. Roy looked down at the baby in his arms, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes I think maybe this is why I found her. Maybe Mary and James sent her to me, knowing I needed something to live for again. It was the most openly emotional thing Sandra had heard him say, and she understood the significance of his trust in sharing such thoughts with her. Their relationship had deepened over the past week, built on shared responsibility and quiet moments of understanding that needed no words. The weather had cleared enough by the end of their second week together to allow for short trips outside the cabin. Roy had fashioned a crude pair of snowshoes and began venturing out to check his trap lines and hunt for fresh meat. Sandra used these brief periods of solitude to reflect on the changes that had occurred in her life, the way two strangers had transformed her lonely existence into something that felt remarkably like a family. Hope continued to thrive under their combined care, her personality beginning to emerge as she grew stronger. She had developed a preference for Roy's deep voice when she was fussy, often calming immediately when he spoke to her in low, soothing tones. With Sandra, she was content to be held and rocked, her tiny fingers grasping at the woman's hair or clothing with increasing strength and coordination. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Hope had been put to bed, Sandra found the courage to voice the question that had been growing in her mind for days. "What happens when spring comes?" she asked quietly. "When the pass is clear and you can travel again?" Roy was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "Originally, I figured I'd take her to the nearest town, find someone to adopt her, give her a proper home with a real family. And now I'm not so sure that's what's best for her." He looked up at Sandra, his expression vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. "She's bonded with you, Sandra. Anyone can see that. And you love her like she's your own." Sandra felt tears spring to her eyes at his words, the truth of them hitting her like a physical blow. She did love Hope, had loved her from almost the first moment she had held her in her arms. The baby had filled a void in her life that she hadn't even realized existed, bringing joy and purpose back into her days. "But I can't ask you to give up your life for her," Sandra said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You have your own path to follow." "Do I?" Roy asked. "What kind of life was I living up in those mountains, Sandra? I was just existing, waiting to die. But these past weeks, taking care of Hope, being here with you, I feel like I'm living again." The admission hung between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Sandra understood the risk he was taking in speaking so openly, the vulnerability required to admit that he had found something worth staying for. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Roy moved closer to her chair, his expression earnest. "I'm saying maybe we could do this together. Raise Hope. Give her the kind of home she deserves. I know it's not conventional, and I know I'm not much of a catch for a woman like you, but—" "Roy," Sandra interrupted, her voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am. Not for convenience, not just for Hope's sake, though she needs both of us. I'm asking because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you, Sandra Hill, with your kindness and your strength, and the way you opened your home and your heart to strangers in need." Sandra felt her world tilt on its axis, everything she had believed about her future suddenly reshaping itself around this unexpected possibility. She looked toward the corner where Hope slept peacefully, then back at Roy's weathered, hopeful face. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "Yes, I'll marry you. And yes, we'll raise Hope together." The kiss they shared was gentle and tentative, a sealing of their commitment that spoke of hope rather than passion, of partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than overwhelming desire. It was exactly right for what they were building together, a foundation strong enough to support the family they were choosing to create. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting rapidly under the warming sun and revealing the green shoots of new growth beneath. Roy and Sandra were married by a traveling preacher who happened through their valley, with Hope gurgling contentedly in Sandra's arms throughout the simple ceremony. The baby had grown remarkably in the months since her rescue, her cheeks round and pink with health, her eyes bright with intelligence and trust. They had expanded the cabin over the winter, Roy's skilled hands adding a second room that would serve as a nursery for Hope, and perhaps someday for other children. The work had given him purpose and direction, channeling his restless energy into creating something lasting and beautiful for his new family. Sandra had never imagined that her life could be transformed so completely by a single night's act of kindness. The woman who had opened her door to strangers in a storm had discovered not just her capacity for love, but her ability to build something meaningful from the fragments of broken lives. Hope had been the catalyst, but the love that grew between Sandra and Roy was its own miracle, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience and care. As she watched Roy teaching Hope to clap her hands, Sandra marveled at the journey that had brought them all together. A mountain man fleeing his past, a widow hiding from her loneliness, and a baby who had survived the unthinkable, all finding exactly what they needed in each other. It was not the life any of them had planned, but it was the life they had chosen, built on foundations of courage, compassion, and the simple recognition that sometimes salvation comes disguised as responsibility. The bloodied mountain man who had arrived at her door with a baby in his arms had brought Sandra more than just unexpected guests that stormy night. He had brought her a future she never dared to dream of, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by the decision to open their hearts to love in all its unexpected forms. And as Hope took her first tentative steps between her adoptive parents, laughing with delight at her own accomplishment, Sandra knew that every moment of uncertainty and fear had been worth it for this perfect, impossible, beautiful life they had created together.